Welcome everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to today's webinar. We're going to let people trickle in over the next couple of minutes and we'll get started by 12:05 at the very latest. And if you'd like to chime into the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from, that would be great. See, we've got a few people from the Twin Cities, but then also a couple of people from Greater Minnesota. That's great. Nate, I hope that your weather up in Duluth is a bit cooler than what we have down here in Minneapolis today, because it has been toasty. Okay, we seem to be leveling off, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And just so you know, this webinar is recorded and we will make the recording available on our YouTube channel within the week. So let me just make sure that I have all of my different windows open here and ready to go. Okay, so I'm very happy today to introduce Rachel Jacobson, from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Rachel is a cross-sector collaborator with over a decade of experience in the climate adaptation, resilience, and environmental fields. As Deputy Director at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, or ASAP, she leads the development, implementation, and continuous improvement of ASAP's programs to promote peer learning, advance effective adaptation practice, and build cohesion across the field of climate change adaptation. Previously, Rachel was a contractor and a fellow at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA, where she implemented two strategic initiatives, Resilience AmeriCorps and the Department of Commerce Natural Capital Business Roundtables. Rachel earned her BA, MPP, and MS degrees from the University of Michigan and holds a certificate in environmental law and regulation from the University of Washington. And she currently lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, I'm going to run over a couple of bookkeeping items. For those of you who are very familiar with our webinar, just hang tight and we'll get started soon. So we start right at noon. We will be ending today also right at 1 p.m. Central Time. And you are all muted during the presentation, but that doesn't prevent you from using the chat. Rachel has indicated that she likes people to be interactive via the chat, so please feel free to do that. We encourage you to submit any questions directly related to the content of the webinar via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so that we can then use those at the end of the presentation for a question and answer session. And as I already said, it will be recorded and posted online within the week. The Q&A is on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and you also have the ability to see other people's questions and to upvote questions that you find particularly interesting. And I will be fielding these at the end of the presentation. Typically, we try to aim for about a 40-minute presentation and 15 minutes for questions at the end. So with that, I'll pass the screen over to Rachel so that she can go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Rachel Jacobson, Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I use she, her pronouns. And as Susie said, I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples. And I'm so excited to be with you today to talk about ASAP's Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit. So what we're going to do today, I will give a short introduction to ASAP for folks who aren't yet familiar with us. And then we'll talk about how to use the Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit, why we created it, what's in it. And then we'll explore some characteristics of Ready to Fund Resilience projects in these 4 categories: collaborative partnerships, intentional processes, innovative accounting, and enabling regulations and policy. And then at the end, we'll talk about getting involved and getting more resources for funding and finance, including talking a little bit about, of course, all of the public funding that we have now available through Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So let's see. Let's get started with our ASAP introduction. So ASAP connects and supports climate change adaptation and climate resilience professionals to better address climate change impacts. And our members are building essential climate resilience for communities, ecosystems, and economies across North America. We help members strengthen their professional network, exchange best practices and practical advice, and accelerate innovation, all leading to more equitable and effective climate adaptation practice. And of course, that explanation probably makes a lot of sense to folks who are part of MCAP. We do operate as a capacity building and social impact network. And here at ASAP, we define adaptation professionals as anyone who's using future climate information in their day-to-day work. And so that includes everyone from engineers and architects to teachers and advocates. We have about 1,000 individual and 50 organizations in our network, concentrated in the US and Canada, with actually a very large concentration of members in the Great Lakes region, which is where a lot of our staff and founding members and founding board members are based. And of course, where I'm based as well. And then our network is almost evenly split between folks working in the public sector at all scales, working in for-profit companies, nonprofit organizations, and in academia. We don't have a lot of members in Minnesota. I counted 16 sort of like paid members in Minnesota right now. We probably have more than that kind of in our broader communication network, but clearly we could have a lot more. So I hope that by the end of this presentation, if you're not an ASAP member yet, you'll consider joining us. And you know, an important thing to know about ASAP is we really believe that we all have something to learn from one another across all of these contexts, whether they be geographical or sectoral. And so that's what we're all about, bringing folks together. And everything we do is with, by, and for our members, and it functions on values like reciprocity, open access, something for every member, and then really most importantly to us, trust. We are building trust to support collaboration so we can make better change together. And at the core of how we operate in ASAP is keeping the people and communities who are what we call at the forefront of climate change central to our work. And you can see here on the screen how we define that. And it includes people who are both highly exposed to climate risk because of the places they live and have fewer resources, capacity, safety nets, or political power to respond. And so this includes Black people, Indigenous peoples, people of color, people with low incomes, unhoused people, immigrants, people with disabilities. And we believe that folks' lived experiences are really essential in designing and implementing equitable and effective climate adaptation efforts. Our Ready to Fund Resilience program, which of course is what we're here to talk about today, is a collaboration between ASAP and Climate Resilience Consulting. Climate Resilience Consulting is a women-owned small business and social enterprise that works with clients to create practical strategies that enhance markets and communities through climate change adaptation. And I also want to thank our funder, Climate Resilience Fund, and thank NOAA and the coordination and collaboration in the Resilience Ecosystem Program for their support as well. So the goal of Ready to Fund Resilience is to support communities in getting climate resilience projects funded. And when we came into this program, came into the beginning of creating the foundations for this program, which was in the fall of 2021, there were already lots of lists and explanations of funding and finance mechanisms that local governments could use to support climate resilience projects. But what was missing was guidance on how to use those mechanisms, how to combine mechanisms, and how to center equity in climate resilience investments. And then also, we didn't really have specific guidance or guidance that really had small and medium-sized communities in mind when it was written. So the Ready to Fund Resilience program is really designed to fill those gaps. And when we thought about how to develop content to fill those gaps, we came in with the idea that a Ready to Fund Resilience project has key characteristics that allow it to most effectively take advantage of existing funding and finance mechanisms while centering equity. So that's kind of like the hypothesis through which we built the program. And you'll see that we've come out the other side with 10 characteristics that form the backbone of the content for all of our resources in the Ready to Fund program. So we built the core of that content, beginning with existing resources and lists and explanations of funding and finance mechanisms, and then expanding to address the remaining needs by undertaking a really wide-ranging literature review. And you can see this is just a sample of the literature that our team consulted. And you can see that there's a huge breadth spanning, the academic sector, media, we have government sources, and then really importantly, I would say private sector, the resources created by and for the private sector. We wanted this content to really speak to what investors and the finance sector is looking for, as well as international. There's a ton of really excellent international content out there that we can really learn from. Sometimes we get kind of mired in our US context, so we really sought to look beyond that. And so our project team worked to uncover and verify and illuminate the characteristics of a Ready to Fund Resilience project. And in addition to reviewing that literature, even perhaps more importantly, we convened our Ready to Fund Resilience expert group and a federal grants program staff focus group. And those two groups made really invaluable contributions to the project through their diversity of experience, which ranged from credit ratings to green banks to mutual aid and municipal bonds, government grants, municipal governance, you name it. And so we're really grateful to the insights and wisdom and feedback from those two groups that we were able to receive. And the result was a program that provides resources for local government staff and the technical assistance providers who support them, and aimed specifically at small and mid-sized local governments. And the program helps them more effectively operate within the resilience funding and finance system, better prepares them to receive funding and finance for climate resilience building, and create social equity through resilience funding and finance. And there are 4 resources available through the program. We have our Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit, which we'll explore today. We have the Ready to Fund Resilience Training, a pilot version of which we're going to be launching next month. And then a peer learning group, which meets monthly and is open to really all adaptation professionals, people seeking climate resilience funding and finance, people providing climate resilience funding and finance, and then a technical input paper, and that will be available for download on the US Climate Resilience Toolkit coming late summer, early fall. So let's dive into the toolkit. The Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit is designed as a self-guided resource, and it's available for free on the ASAP website. It includes explanations, examples, suggested actions that are meant to ensure that climate resilience processes and projects are designed in a way that readies them to receive funding and finance. And so, like I sort of alluded to before, it's important to remember that the toolkit is not a list or an explanation of funding and finance mechanisms. And it's not a guide where local governments can find climate resilience funding. It's really those explanations, examples, and suggested actions about how to use funding and finance mechanisms. But I will say that the toolkit does include some links to those types of resources, and it does have some sort of like appendices that do address some of that content as well. So the content that we developed in the toolkit addresses some fundamental realities of the climate resilience funding and finance context in the US that I think are really helpful to go through before we, at the outset. And so first, public funding for climate resilience is increasing, and we see that most markedly with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this presentation. But public funding alone is not enough to meet communities' needs. We need more private sector investment in climate resilience projects, and we need ways to bring together public and private funding and finance. Secondly, there are some deep structural issues that are exemplified and exacerbated by traditional funding and finance mechanisms. And if we are to ensure that funding and finance for climate resilience gets to those people who need it most, like we talked about before, people at the forefront, Black people, Indigenous peoples, other people of color, people with low incomes, we have to really examine and change traditional mechanisms to direct investment there and right historic marginalization and disinvestment. Local governments experience some systemic barriers to centering equity and securing sufficient funding and finance for climate resilience investment. We'll talk about those barriers in a second. And then finally, resilience is not an end state. It's a process of ongoing monitoring and shifting and realignment. And so the toolkit and other content within the Ready to Fund program, rather than offering a roadmap to an endpoint, it offers guidance and support to communities to develop flexible and dynamic partnerships and policies and processes that create a positive funding and finance environment to support climate resilience in their community. Let's dive a little deeper into some of the challenges that communities, particularly small and medium-sized local governments, experience when seeking to secure funding and finance for their climate resilience projects. So one is that traditional accounting practices may not be enough to get projects off the ground. In a lot of climate resilience projects, the benefits accrue years after project completion, and they may include benefits that are kind of poorly understood or difficult to quantify. So improvements in the environment and quality of life, and our existing cost benefit assessments really privilege benefits to high dollar value assets, meaning that projects in lower resource communities may have a lower cost benefit ratio than those in well-resourced communities. Also, a lot of climate resilience projects don't have a direct revenue source. So, renewable power, for example, generates energy that can be sold, but a flood mitigation project doesn't necessarily have a revenue stream. And so it can be hard for these projects to attract investment because without revenue associated with them, they're deemed what's called unbankable. And so projects need revenue because projects need revenue in order to pay back debt, for example. Capacity can be a huge issue, as we all know. Even if, let's say, grant funding is available, it can be difficult to even write those grants. Support to center equity. A lot of communities face conflicting guidance about what their government's overall short and long-term plans are and what needs to be done to build resilience. So, for instance, a state may advocate that coastal communities consider sea level rise in their decisions while also needing to increase their housing stock to address a housing crisis. And those two things can feel incompatible when at the outset and when thinking about priorities. And then lots of regulatory barriers, some that are inside control of local governments and some that aren't. And the content in the Ready to Fund Toolkit is designed to help local governments and the technical assistance providers that support them to cope with these barriers, to work around them, and work to change them. Because again, some of them are in the control of local governments and some of them are not. So I'll take a minute or two now to walk you through kind of more explicitly what type of content is available in the toolkit. At the end, we'll do like a very short peek inside the actual toolkit where we'll click around a little bit. But for now, in the toolkit, what you'll find First is some introductory content, news pieces, and then also kind of like a 101 or an explanation of how public and private funding and finance can work together. So this is like great content as you're just diving in and just getting started to kind of get oriented into that, again, that funding and finance system, a lot of the stuff that we just went over. Then there's the content that describes those key characteristics I was talking about, the 10 characteristics of climate resilience projects that are ready to receive funding and finance while centering equity. And we'll be diving into those in a minute. And this includes what those for each characteristic, each of the 10, what is it? Why is it important? How do you build it into your projects? And then some action steps that local governments can take. And then this is what we'll look at a little bit later, links to supplemental resources. And then there's also a section where you can find recommendations for which characteristics to explore based on your specific needs and challenges. So if you're really challenged by a lack of staff capacity, okay, let me find the characteristics that are going to most directly address that challenge of lack of staff capacity first and foremost. In the toolkit, there are also quick references on important topics like policy actions to incentivize equitable climate resilience investment, financial mechanisms that manage risk, innovative financing mechanisms. We were just talking about cost benefit ratios. So there's a kind of a long list of strategies that can help you change cost benefit ratios to give weight to those benefits that will accrue further in the future. There's federal funding sources for climate resilience projects, a snapshot of all of the federal funding sources. Of course, this is changing all the time. So this is a snapshot from earlier this calendar year, but a good place to get started. And I'll share some more information on federal funding sources later on as well. And then characteristics of climate resilience funding and finance partners from across sectors. So just a whole range of really great quick references on topics of interest. So I'm going to jump into those 10 characteristics of ready to fund resilience projects next. And as we go through that, I really encourage folks to think about these 3 questions. So 1, how might these characteristics help you set up your projects for long-term success and support implementation? 2, what potential changes did these characteristics inspire for your current projects? And then 3, what challenges do you face that aren't addressed in the toolkit? Because I'm sure there are many, and we're always looking to hear about them and to improve the content that we're providing to folks. So here you can see the 10 characteristics of ready to fund resilience projects. So resilience projects that are ready to receive funding and finance are those that 1, leverage supportive partnerships to increase potential funding and finance available. 2, get buy-in from community and government leaders in positions of power. 3, prioritize investment in communities that are at the front lines of climate change or at the forefront, as we saw in that previous definition, but those folks most impacted by climate change. 4, co-develop projects with the people most impacted by project outcomes and directly integrate their knowledge and experience. 5, combine funding and finance from a variety of sources to cover all stages of the project life. 6, bundle projects regionally, by program or by hazard to create economies of scale for implementation. 7, take an innovative approach to project accounting practices to communicate long-term social benefits in dollars. 8, have processes and outcomes grounded in a resilience metrics framework. 9, are grounded within existing community plans which communicate a pipeline of projects. And 10, resilience projects that are ready to receive funding and finance are those that benefit from policies that incentivize or mandate equitable climate resilience investment. And we've segmented these into 4 categories: collaborative partnerships, intentional processes, innovative accounting practices, and enabling regulatory framework and policy. And I'll go a little deeper on one characteristic from each category. So the first category is collaborative partnerships. Ready to fund resilience projects use partnerships across scales and sectors to increase project capacity. And you can see here on the slide a snapshot of a table that we have in the toolkit that describes different partnership ideas and the benefits that can come from those partnerships. And leveraging these supportive partnerships can increase local government's capacity to obtain climate resilience dollars by facilitating community collaboration, improving investor confidence, increasing efficiencies of scale, building and transferring knowledge, and accessing new funds or pooling existing funds. And I'd love for folks to share in the chat how you currently identify and leverage partnerships to advance your climate resilience or sustainability agendas. And that sustainability word was left over from a presentation that I just gave to sustainability folks. So we'll focus on climate resilience today. So how do you identify and leverage partnerships to advance your climate resilience agenda? Just looking for a couple of examples. Working with businesses in Red Wing to support sustainability goals of the city of Red Wing. Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. And thanks for putting that question in the chat, Susie. And folks can keep chiming in on this. I'll move on, but feel free to keep answering in the chat. So next we have the category of intentional processes. And this includes embedding equity in project planning and implementation processes, as well as thinking about the entire lifespan of a project, from inception to operation and maintenance, and doing, thinking about all of those phases as you're seeking funding and finance. And seeking a variety of funding and finance types across public and private sources to cover all stages of the project life is known as blended finance. And leveraging blended finance can expedite the funding process. It can ensure that all components of the process are covered, including, gave some examples before, but also like grant writing, project planning and design, and execution. It can cater to the development and application of climate adaptation plans with a longer range timeline. So it can be thinking about further down the road in that process. And it can open up opportunities for new sources to cover grant match requirements, for example, which is a barrier that a lot of folks face. So I would love to know if anyone has a process or a project that they have going on right now that's using blended finance. Or alternatively, how do you keep the entire project life in mind? And I'll put that question in the chat. And thanks, Kristen, for chiming in here about getting local community members who are experts that can help move the project planning forward. And partnering with community members and residents absolutely is really important. The next category here is innovative accounting practices. So ready to fund resilience projects take an innovative approach to project accounting to make a stronger business case and communicate benefits in dollars, because that is the language that drives financial decision making. And it's a little sad to say that comprehensive in this context is actually innovative, but in many ways it is. We can especially see this again as we examine the conventional approach to cost benefit analysis. The scope is off. Traditional cost benefit analysis is infrastructure centric, and it really kind of lacks that holistic human focus. It doesn't embed equity like we talked about before. Higher priced parcels and assets and systems are valued higher than lower priced ones. And most of the lower priced ones are owned by low and moderate income people or Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color. And so that discounted value in the cost benefit analysis produces an indirect but a very real negative impact on those communities, while wealthier communities received in that indirect positive impact. And then the time frame is kind of wrong for climate resilience projects in traditional cost-benefit analysis because immediate needs outweigh longer-term considerations. And as we know, climate resilience investments may take years or even decades to have their benefits realized. So this is just one example of how we can use comprehensive accounting practices to make a strong business case for action, is to use alternative methods for cost-benefit assessment. And there are many, many ideas, resources, and links in the toolkit that can support your efforts to modify cost-benefit analyses so that they take these issues into account. But some of the most important questions to ask up front are not about what methods we're using, but rather some more scoping questions, such as, does the process we use to determine who and what we prioritize serve our community? Who decides which outcomes we value? And what should our criteria be in determining what outcomes we value? And so that's a way to even just kind of get started on the road to using the right accounting practices and to choosing those methodologies, to be thinking about those types of questions. And then our final category for the 10 characteristics of ready to fund resilience projects is enabling regulatory frameworks and enabling policies. And as we talked about before, local governments only have so much control over these, but one area where they do have a lot of control is making sure that projects are grounded within existing community plans that articulate a long-term pipeline of projects. And this can offer more certainty and less risk to entice investors. It can help local government leaders and partners better identify and act on synergies between projects to pool resources and share costs. And it can address questions that credit rating agencies or investors may have. And to do this well, it's important to mainstream climate resilience into planning, even plans that aren't explicitly climate plans. Ensure plans and projects address long-term climate impacts. Break down silos across government departments, and connect with political planning and visioning to get buy-in from folks in power. So I would encourage you to reflect on this question of how your local government's plans, both short and long term, reflect the community's climate resilience goals. And if you're not working with a local government, you can be thinking about other scales of government, or you can be thinking about even the local government that you live in if you don't work in the local government. So next, I want to go over to the Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit and just share really briefly on how to use kind of the navigation in that toolkit and find additional resources. So I am going to attempt to switch over to that right now. I guess I didn't really need to stop my screen share, but here we go. All right, so here's the Ready to Fund Resilience Toolkit. And Susie did share the link in the chat. And first, I will say it takes a second to load, so thank you for your patience. But once it loads, you can see the introduction and news and analysis at the top. And then you can see this table of contents. Table of contents. And I really encourage you to focus in here on the table of contents to think about where you want to go. And as we just talked about the 10 characteristics of Ready to Fund Resilience projects. So if you click there, it'll take you to the 10 characteristics of Ready to Fund Resilience projects, and you can see them here, 1 through 10. And I want to click here on use comprehensive accounting practices that make a strong business case for action. That's one that we just talked about with cost-benefit analyses. So like I mentioned, we have the what and why, and we talked a lot about that already. We have the how. Here is a little bit more in depth on the how. And then we have some guidance to think and act. So here are those questions that we just saw about what processes we use to determine who and what we prioritize, Each how section includes partner, suggestions, and then action steps. We also have a case study for each of the characteristics and then additional resources. And this section of additional resources is particularly robust, which is why I wanted to share it with you all. So you'll see here, like, we're not just suggesting that you do your best to change the way that you do cost benefit analysis, but rather use the many, many additional tools and resources that are out there, and you can click straight from the toolkit and get to them about how to change your methodologies for these assessments. So let's move back over to, we will jump. All right. So that's how you can get additional resources on the toolkit. And now I would like to share just a few more insights, if I can find my notes. Give me 1 second here. Here we go. Okay, thanks for bearing with me there. There's a certain type of resource that is being talked about a lot right now and is becoming much more widely available. And that is funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly before we move to the Q&A, because I know that that's something that we find is on a lot of folks' minds. So we've got the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and about half of that money, about $590 billion, is going to be spent by, we're talking about $1.2 trillion total. Roughly half of that is going to be spent by federal agencies directly, the rest distributed to states and local governments in 4 different ways: formula grants, so specific allocations to each state; competitive grants, and states, local governments, non-governmental entities, depending on the program, are eligible to apply, loans, and then the Highway Trust Fund. And if you're not already doing so, here are some tips to help position yourself to receive dollars from Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And these recommendations were developed specifically for local governments, but can apply to others as well. And they were developed from a set of resources that we've compiled for folks. And Susie is going to share that link in the chat. Thanks so much, Susie. So the first is familiarize yourself with the funding opportunities, which you can do by reviewing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act guidebook. And then there are a couple of resources on that sheet that will help you kind of stay abreast of opportunities as they're becoming available. Second recommendation is to really kind of cement working relationships that you'll need to successfully apply for funding that will benefit, again, that whole project life. And so this includes relationships with the state for developing proposals, relationships that can help you align statewide priorities for infrastructure development that support your own climate resilience and equity goals, relationships with communities and organizations that have the capacity to pursue federal grants, and relationships with community-based organizations that serve those frontline communities or communities at the forefront. Cementing even the relationships across departments where you work. And then also relationships with regional offices for the federal agencies that align with the funding streams that you're interested in, so that they can direct you to the latest information, notice of funding opportunities, and technical assistance for the grants that their agency is running. And then finally, last tip here is to identify ongoing projects that can be supported through these opportunities and develop a pipeline of new projects. projects. So prioritize your community's capital needs and develop a project pipeline. Continue to work on foundational planning for things like, I mean, not just climate adaptation, but hazard mitigation and transportation, and make sure that project pipelines are aligned to those plans. And then finally, think about the projects that maybe you thought were impossible because of lack of funding or lack of regional coordination. This is once in a generation funding opportunity that will really require bold, inclusive thinking. So we should all be thinking about that now. So, you know, just a couple of notes here before we finish up. Really important to be thinking about how we can get that money where it's most needed. And we've talked about that a little bit so far in this presentation. But you know, thinking about the fact that it's probably a specific community, a specific neighborhood, or a specific group of residents that you work with, or if you work in a public organization that's within your jurisdiction. And the Biden administration does have Justice 40, which by executive order stipulates that 40% of these funds, of these investments, need the benefits of these investments flow to disadvantaged communities. But those are the benefits, not the dollars. There's also like some questions around how the screening tool that the administration is using leaves behind some communities that have historically been harmed by government action. And the administration has issued implementation guidance, but doesn't have a lot of authority to make sure that that implementation actually occurs for Justice 40. So it's kind of really up to us to make sure that we're advocating that that money gets where it's needed most. And then, of course, we need to be thinking about these Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act dollars all as climate action dollars. And that means that we need to be thinking about not just the phase of the project that might be covered by a specific federal grant that we get out of this funding, but seeking a variety of funding and finance from both public and private sectors to cover all stages of our project lives, again, from planning through operation and maintenance and monitoring and evaluation. And of course, you can learn much more about that in the toolkit. And it also means demanding that we're using best available climate information in making decisions about what to invest in. If we're working with consultants, making sure that they're using, that we're asking them to use best available climate information by putting that language, for example, in RFPs that we might put out for implementing these projects, and that we're really thinking about how to integrate principles for equitable and effective climate adaptation in the projects that we're funding out of these dollars. And I will share a link in the chat to ASAP's Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation, where you can learn about that. And we also do public and tailored trainings on those principles for equitable, effective climate adaptation as well. So before I close here, I just want to share some ways to get involved in the Ready to Fund Resilience program and in ASAP. So we are going to be launching registration for a pilot version of our Ready to Fund Resilience training, hopefully this week, fingers crossed. And that training will include 2 live sessions on July 27th and August 10th, and a take-home assignment the week of August 1st. So it'll be kind of like a mini 3-week training where you can really both dive more into the content as well as have an opportunity to collaborate with the folks that you work in. And then, or work with rather. And then we have our Funding and Finance Peer Learning Group that's supported by Climate Resilience Consulting, and that meets monthly on the 4th Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And in that group, folks are kind of advancing the conversation on strategies to help communities get their climate resilience projects funded. And that group also explores kind of cutting edge ideas in resilience funding and finance, and discusses the law and policy changes that are needed to enable funding and finance to be more accessible to local communities. So we have a meeting upcoming on June 27th at noon Eastern Time, 11 Central Time, that we would love to see you at. And then of course, you're invited to use and share the online toolkit. And there's also a space to share feedback on the toolkit, and we'd really love to hear from you on that. And then here are just a few ways that you can get involved with ASAP. You can join ASAP. You can attend an upcoming peer learning session, a webinar, or a training session. And you can see all the opportunities here on the slide, or by visiting the ASAP calendar. And I'll share a link to the ASAP calendar in the chat as well as we move into the Q&A. And I'm just going to put this slide back up as we move into our discussion, because I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you on any questions, but on these questions in particular. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. And so would you like people to share some of their ideas related to these questions in the chat box?
Oh, either way, just wanted to put this up in case folks didn't have a question in mind and this was helpful as a prompt.
I see. We do actually have a couple that have popped up. I'm going to start us off with a really simple one, which is, what is the process for actually, you mentioned that there's only 16 people in Minnesota that you could find that are part of ASAP. So what's the process for becoming a part of ASAP, and how can people who are listening in today maybe do that if they want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so ASAP membership is open to anyone who, I just put the link in the chat. It's just adaptationprofessionals.org/join us. And we have a pay what you can membership model. So you can contribute whatever fits into your budget. And you will need to read and sign our code of conduct and professional ethics. And then you're a member. But as I mentioned, ASAP operates as a social impact network. So you get from the network what you put into it. So we always encourage folks who sign up to jump right in and engage, whether it be in peer learning, in webinars and trainings, or even just by submitting items to be included in our weekly and monthly newsletters. So, but really simple process, just go to our website and click join us and get ready to sign on to the code of ethics.
I think that's also so important because climate adaptation is kind of a nebulous field. It's hard to define what exactly is climate adaptation, because in reality, it should be involved in almost everything we do. And so I love that you have all created this network where people can find other people who are doing the same sort of work and who have the same sort of goals. I think that's so important. We have a question from Kristen in the Q&A. She asks, are there specific states that you see who are supporting small and mid-sized local governments in their resilience work that are doing it very well? What are they doing right? And who is taking the lead in terms of sectors, state, nonprofit, or university?
Yeah, I mean, the two states that come to mind are Massachusetts and California, and both of those places have, has had strong executive actions that have created climate change programs that are really responsive to and supportive of local government needs. So strong statewide planning processes and data portals, but even more importantly, a really strong way to get funds passed through directly to local governments. And then on the kind of the other side of that, like making sure that there's capacity building along the way so that those local governments can be using those funds in a way that's really smart and future focused. And yeah, so CalAdapt is a great example. And we see now, like, there's just been, I mean, obviously California, it's hard to like compare things to California because it's such a big state and it has such a huge population and it has more resources than a lot of states do, but the model is there, right? It's a model of prioritizing public funding for climate action and climate adaptation specifically. And it's a model of pairing that with really strong capacity building. And in Massachusetts, we see something similar with the, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the state program, but we have something similar in Massachusetts. And both of those places, like, I think what has been enabled is for community-led, community-driven projects to actually get implemented, right? So for example, in Massachusetts, the the local governments went through kind of like a state, almost like mandated. It's not mandated. I mean, they're signing up to participate, but they have covered almost all the local governments in the entire state. So they go through a planning process. And then there are implementation grants that they can get to then actually move forward on implementing the projects that they identify through that planning process.
And do you think this sort of initiative needs to come from the state government down, or are there opportunities for it to be built from the ground up? For example, in Minnesota, there are several cities that are involved in all sorts of, in their own adaptation planning. And what are the opportunities for them to kind of come together to work things in the other direction?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, I think the toolkit talks about this a lot, which is that, we can't rely on public funding. I mean, we're always going to say that more public funding is needed, and it is. But we can't just rely on public funding, and we can't just rely on public mandates, and certainly not from just the state level down. So I think something that's really promising are partnerships at the local level between cities and businesses, for example. And that's what someone put, I think it was Amy, talked about in the chat, right? So, starting with where the assets and the interests and frankly, sometimes the money is, right, in a local government. And then it's our responsibility as we think about like how to direct that to make sure that the benefits of that are flowing to the people that need it most. And so I think that like using that momentum and using those existing partnerships to combine both public and private funding and finance is much easier to do at the local level, because that's where those relationships are. That's where those private sector assets are actually sitting. And that's where a lot of investors are going to already have interest and already have a stake. So certainly it can and should happen from the ground up. But there are just, there are different levers that we want and need to pull at each of those levels.
We had a question come into the chat a little while ago. This one's from Amy, who you just mentioned. And she writes, thanks for the great presentation. What are your best tips for encouraging people to not only work on adaptation, but simultaneously climate change prevention, such as emissions reductions? Which is, I know, not necessarily the point of your talk, but if you have something to touch on to that, that would be also very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when we, for example, like we do a training on the principles of quality climate change adaptation practice, and I'll put a link in the chat to our living guide to the principles of climate change adaptation. And this is also in our code of conduct and professional ethics is, we absolutely are saying that as climate adaptation professionals, we need to be addressing the root causes of climate change. And I think that it can be challenging. It can be challenging because I think sometimes one of the reasons why people find themselves working on adaptation is because they want to work on climate and it's too hard to work on mitigation, right? And I would say that like, rather than, I don't know that I have any tips for like convincing people that they should work on adaptation and mitigation simultaneously. I more have tips for, as someone who is working on adaptation, how can you make sure that you are simultaneously addressing mitigation? And, obviously a great way to do that is through the lens of co-benefits. So, thinking about what are going to be the co-benefits of this project for both adaptation and mitigation, but even more importantly, is thinking about all of our projects and our decisions through the lens of maladaptation, right? And understanding that maladaptation can mean a lot of different things, but one thing that it can mean is if we are doing a project that is going to be increasing greenhouse gas emissions over the baseline, right? That is also maladaptation. And so making sure that it's part of our own accounting in the projects that we're setting up, that mitigation is being considered and being accounted for as we think about those adaptation benefits. So yeah, I think my best tip is, especially if you're in a position where you're, maybe it's like more politically feasible to be talking about you know, mitigation of natural hazards risks, right? And disaster risk reduction and things like that, to be kind of in the background, like doing that accounting on, okay, so how does this, both what can the co-benefits be, but also, making sure that that's part of your project accounting, that emissions are being factored in.
I love the comment on co-benefits, because we talk often at MCAP about how mitigation and adaptation are kind of two sides of the same coin. And often the line between them is really blurry, and you end up kind of doing both at the same time. And I think that that's a very good point. We have about 4 minutes left, and I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to ask one more if we have a couple more minutes. I was curious, you mentioned 10 characteristics of a project that is ready to fund. Does one of them stand out to you as having more weight than the others? Or do you think, like, if people only have so much capacity, are there a few characteristics they should really hone in on? Or does it need to be a well-balanced circle that includes all 10?
Yeah, I would encourage us to look at this through an abundance mindset, right? Which is that what we have the ability to do is to make our projects the best they can be with the resources that we have. I think it's really important that everyone understands each of the characteristics. And then whatever position you're in, or whatever position your project team is in, there'll be opportunities to, turn up the volume on one or another, right? But I think it's really context dependent. And so I think the best thing that we can do is to understand and learn about and have resources at the ready for each of them, so that in any given context, we can assess, okay, what characteristics really need to come to bear here. I will say, like, a lot of the characteristics are really similar to characteristics that just make a project a good resilience project, right? And a lot of what the toolkit does is kind of frame that in a way that's going to help, especially, again, local government folks, make the case to potential investors. Again, because so much of this is about blending together public and private funding and finance, like to make the case, especially to private investors, why their project is a good investment, right? And so I think I would say, like, depending on where you're coming from, right? If that's a new concept to you, what I would encourage you to do, rather than thinking about what do I have the capacity to include, what do I need to leave out, is think about, like, where is the opportunity to add the potential for getting more resources for this project, and to kind of focus there, right? And to be, like, leaning into that as you're thinking about adjustments to make over the course of a project.
So changing your mindset from more of a deficit one to an opportunity focused one.
Yeah. And dodging your question at the same time. As any good panelist, that's their
You answer the question with the question that you want to answer, and then you pick that one instead. Well, we are just at the hour, so thank you so much again, Rachel, for joining us. This was, I hope, very helpful for everybody who tuned in today. And I will make an effort to share some of these links in a follow-up email after the webinar for those of you who were here, so that you can look more into it on your own time. And also, please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey that we send out every time. This helps us to make sure that we're providing content that's interesting to all of you. And you also have the opportunity to provide suggestions for future webinars. So everyone, please join me in thanking Rachel for giving our webinar today. And we look forward to seeing you all next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.